Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, and fish of all ages, it is that time again. It is March. It is the first weekend of March, and I put the old in old school gaming. I put the mega in Megadungeon. It is Megadungeon March. Like we do every year, we explore the very bizarre concept of mega dungeons. But first, what is a mega dungeon, and how is a mega dungeon different than a regular dungeon? Now, the easiest description, of course, is mega dungeons tend to be bigger. A regular dungeon can be 2, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 rooms. A dungeon usually tells one consistent story from beginning to end. You know, to use my favorite, Storm King's Thunder, against the Hill Giant, the dungeons of Storm King's Thunder, the dungeons of G1 against the Giants are all giant bases. First you go to the Hill Giant Fort, and then you go to the Frost Giant Ice Cave, and then you go to the Fire Giant Castle, or the Storm Giant's Flying Cloud, the Stone Giant's Stone Quarry, the Pop-Tart Giant's Aisle on the supermarket. There's not a Pop-Tart Giant, there should be. So it tells one consistent story from beginning to end. You know, you go in the first room of the dungeon and there's giants here. You go in the fifth room of the dungeon and there's giants here and giant-related shenanigans. And you get to the final room of the dungeon, it's like, look, more giants and more giant-related shenanigans. And everything in here sort of is built around the theme of giants. So a dungeon tends to tell a linear story. A dungeon tends to be smaller than a mega dungeon. A mega dungeon might have 100, 200, 500 rooms. It might be more than one level. It might be split up all over the place. And it tends to tell a non-linear story. Each level, each section telling a different story, and tends to be bigger. But that's not always true, because there are some dungeons that have more rooms than some mega dungeons. So there's more to just the thing than size. And the main thing, like I said, is that a mega dungeon tends to have multiple separate layers, long, complex histories, different levels constructed by different eras with different themes. So being built, being lost, being rediscovered, stuff like that. Now, the very first mention of Mega Dungeon was in 1974 in Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, where they were describing a vast multi-layer dungeon as the primary location in which the game originally took place, which we now know was Castle Greyhawk. And probably the most well-known D&D dungeon is Undermountain. And Undermountain is definitely the perfect example of non-linear, lots of rooms, lots of levels, intercontinental ecologies, tons of different stories being told, a long history of being found, lost, added on. If you want a real-world equivalent to a mega dungeon, IKEA, the Pentagon, UCLA. You know, UCLA is a perfect example, and so is the Pentagon. It started as one thing, and then something else was added on, because nobody ever sets out to build a mega dungeon. It just sort of grows because it has that long history. So, like, you know, to use UCLA as an example, nobody planned for UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, to be as big as it is, to be as sprawled out as it is, to be an interconnected mess, to have this huge underground environment that it has, multiple buildings, multiple parking lots, buildings, annexes, and subdivisions, and new campuses, and old campuses, and campuses buildings dating back to the founding, and buildings that were built on top of buildings, and building things that are underneath the building. So it went from being just a few, college buildings to this huge sprawling mess in Santa Monica, and nobody actually knows, how big is this? Where does UCLA start? Where does UCLA end? How many of these things are interconnected with the underground? I mean, hell, most people don't even know how big the hospital is, much less the entire campus. So UCLA would be a perfect example of a mega dungeon in real life, a series of things that just sort of got built on top of each other, have a long history. Each one sort of serves its own purpose. And Undermountain would be the perfect example in Dungeons and Dragons of it started as one thing and then something else and then something happened and something else and maybe it got lost for a while and somebody else rediscovered it and then they dug this way and then blah, blah, blah. And then you just have this big intercontinental mess. So that's probably one of the best ways. Another difference between dungeon and mega dungeon is a dungeon has a beginning, middle, and end. And usually it's not repeated. You go through Temple of the Dagger King. You clear out all the giants in the steading of the hill giants. You kill the cultists of the cult of the frozen Pop-Tart giant. And then that's it. The place is done. You probably never go there again, and probably it's never heard from again. I mean, realistically, if you left a big empty building, something would move in, right? So, Dungeons and Dragons Squatters. That sounds like a great name for a TV show. Tonight on Dungeons and Dragons Squatters. Maybe that'll be my next campaign. Dungeons and Dragons Squatters. Support me, Dr. Pepper. But, yeah, that thought isn't given to Against the Hill Giant or, Cult of the Frozen Pop-Tart or whatever. You go in, you kill everything. Maybe you do it in one sitting. Maybe you do it in 2 sittings. Maybe you do it in 3 sittings, and then you move on. It has a beginning, middle, and end. Mega Dungeons, on the other hand, don't. They don't end. Because they're so big and because there's so many stories, you could literally run Mega Dungeons, the same Mega Dungeon, for years. Because it's so big, because there's so much going on, because there's so many random variables, because if you clear out a section, chances are, much like in real life, something will move in to refill that section, as opposed to a regular dungeon, where if you clear out a dungeon, nothing moves in. It's just gone, it's forgotten, it vanishes, nobody ever goes there again. We just forgot. The Temple of the Frozen Pop-Tart, yeah, it's gone. We cleared it out, never have to worry about it. But the Mega Dungeon of Doom, oh, we got it. That's constantly a threat. So that's probably the main difference. Size, but not always. But just more of the fact that it just keeps going and going. You could go through the same Mega Dungeon over and over and over again. You could run a Mega Dungeon campaign as long as you could keep people interested in reasons to keep going back. You could just make the Mega Dungeon the whole premise of your campaign. Castle Greyhawk was just basically them repeatedly going in, leaving, starting over, exploring a different section, leaving, whatever. And again, the multiple themes, the multiple stories, the multiple factions, the long history. That's probably the other thing. Now, not every Mega Dungeon follows that sort of random crazy that Undermountain follows. Some have a single consistent story, like Barrowmaze and the Banewarns, and Lost Caverns of Thesia, where it's still the same thing. It's huge. It has a huge history, and there's a lot going on, and you could run it for years, but it does have a consistent theme. Barrowmaze, undead. Pretty much everything you're going to run into is undead related, undead adjacent. Things, ecologies that would exist in undead-based theme. In UCLA, it pretty much tells a one consistent story. The only thing you're going to run into UCLA is college students, maintenance crew, teachers, and drunk frat boys. To use the real life example, you're not going to really run into much else. So, but that idea, that's a more recent idea in Mega Dungeons, of the Mega Dungeon kind of following the regular dungeons and just being bigger. I mean, Barrowmaze is just a bigger version of a undead themed tomb. But instead of having 5, 10, 15 rooms, it has 500 rooms plus a whole hex crawl above it that you could just explore for years. Now, some people like Mega Dungeon campaigns, some people don't. I love them. I think they're fascinating if they're well done. There are a few that I think are just great. Most are just, not that good. I don't know, with today's environment of gaming, you could run a Mega Dungeon campaign. You'd have to keep people interested to keep going. They'd have to have some investment. The fact that Mega Dungeons are so big leads to the possibility that factions would exist, develop in the Mega Dungeon. the orc faction and the deep elf faction and the bandit faction and the dragon faction, and they might work together. They might work each other. And, one way to keep the player interested would be to have the factions use the players as agents, or the players to, good, bad, and the ugly, and play the factions against each other. And, again, you'd have to be reasons to keep the player characters interested. So there probably have to be NPCs in the town outside the dungeon that gives them reasons to go back to the dungeon. And there'd have to be things in the dungeon to keep them wanting to come back. Or the dungeon would just have to be so dangerous that there had to be sections they couldn't get to for a while. And then they'd have to build themselves up and then go back to explore it. I mean, the motivation is the hard part. The building it is the hard part. But the idea, let's face it, is not realistic. I mean, Undermountain, to use a perfect example, is underneath Waterdeep. Most of the people in Waterdeep don't even know it's there. And the people that do know it's there think it's sort of like a tourist trap. I mean, there's literally a bar where people pay to go into Undermountain. The Yawning Portal. I mean, nobody thinks at any point in time, is it dangerous and a threat to our city that we're literally built on top of this massive complex of rolling doom, and at any moment it could burst out into the city and destroy us? No, it's like having our city built on top of Disneyland. We're fine. Don't worry about it. So yeah, realistically, something that large probably would not last unless it had a consistent infrastructure, consistent, imports, export, consistent financing, consistent reason to exist. The Pentagon works because it serves a purpose, and all that, that huge, vast building, every part of that building is constantly growing, constantly serving a purpose, constantly has an infrastructure, constantly has import and export, constantly is spending money, constantly is making money. Same with UCLA. But the Undermountain, it serves no purpose. It's just a bunch of encounters for player characters to go fight with a vague theme that a crazy wizard built it. So really, I mean, the theme of your Undermountain, your dungeon campaign could just be get rid of all this, okay? Just clear this mess out. I never want to ever hear the word Undermountain again. Here's some money, here's some items, go down there room by room, deal with it. Blow the shit up. So there we go. That is the description of what a Megadungeon is. And how would you run a Megadungeon, especially with today's audience? You'd have to give them reasons to keep going back besides just EXP and stuff. There'd have to be some intrinsic story that keeps them interested enough that they would want to base their entire character life around this town, this area, this huge, sprawling mass of rolling death. So there you go. Daddy, what is a Megadungeon? All right, we've explained it. Now we're going to go into one. For fantasy Megadungeon, we're going to use Barrowmaze because I like it a lot better than Undermountain. And for real world Megadungeon, UCLA. Because, 99% of my family has gone to UCLA. And, all right. So if you appreciate this content, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, support, buy me a sandwich, support me, Dr. Pepper. And let's get ready to build.